Hi, in this video I'm going to go over some logical reasoning questions. They come from section 2 of prep test 83. Um, if you have like a PDF copy of the test or um, a hard copy of the test, then it would be section 1. But on Law Hub, they've reorganized a lot of the tests, like the vast majority of the tests, so that logic games is first, then you have 2 logical reasoning sections, and then the 4th one is reading comp. So on Law Hub, you're going to have that order, whereas the tests that were published as hard copies are going to be in like a randomized order. Okay. Great. All right. So let's just go ahead and get into it. I've flagged down here the questions that I'm going to review. So if there are any questions outside of this range that you're interested in getting explanations for, just let me know. All right. So I start by reading the question stem. And I'm just trying to figure out generally what type of question I'm dealing with. Things that are important here is that they recognize that the argument is flawed. So I have an argument, I know that it's flawed. That kind of gives me a roadmap of my first few steps. So because the stimulus is an argument, I know that there's going to be a conclusion and there's going to be some kind of support for that conclusion. So I want to identify both of those things. I also know that the argument is flawed, so I'd like to try to understand why that support isn't enough to prove that conclusion. So that would be the flaw. And then we are looking at like a parallel reasoning question. So the structure is going to be relevant as well, but really it's the flaw that we want to focus on here. So reading the question stem, the flawed nature of the argument can most effectively be demonstrated by noting that by parallel reasoning, we could argue that blank. So if we're going to choose an answer choice here, we really want it to show that the argument in the stimulus is flawed. And a way that we can do that is by showing that the same structure, the same reasoning structure could lead us to an absurd conclusion. So we are looking for kind of a level of absurdity in the correct answer choice as well, because that will effectively demonstrate that we could use the same reasoning to come to an absurd conclusion. Therefore, the reasoning must be flawed in some way. Okay. All right, now to the stimulus. The only vehicles that have high resale values are those that are well maintained. Thus, any well-maintained vehicle has high resale value. So the conclusion is the last sentence, and the support that's offered is the first sentence. I would note that there is conditional language. So these would fall under like category of conditional words and phrases. The phrase "the only" indicates a sufficient condition, and the word "any" also indicates a sufficient condition. So this would be a type of argument where it would be really valuable for you to have kind of memorized lists of indicator words for conditional reasoning and understanding how those indicate the relationship between the other parts of that sentence. So in this case, the only is introducing vehicles that have high resale values. So knowing that a vehicle has a high resale value is sufficient to know that it is well maintained. Okay, so if I wanted to like write this out as a conditional relationship, I would say if a vehicle has high resale value, then it's well maintained. The contrapositive of that would be if it's not well maintained, then that vehicle doesn't have high resale value. So I'm just putting the slashes in front to indicate we need to negate that term. So yeah, it being well maintained is a necessary condition, but it wouldn't be sufficient. So when we get to the conclusion, what they've done in the conclusion is they've actually just flipped these two terms. So if we were to write out the conclusion, it would look like this: if well maintained, then high resale value. Okay, so yeah, and we're talking about a vehicle, right? Any well-maintained vehicle has a high resale value, so we don't really need that part of the term. And the contrapositive would be doesn't have a high resale value, then it's not a well-maintained vehicle. So this is the conclusion, and this is the premise. We actually can't derive the conclusion from the premise. This is what we would call a mistaken reversal. Okay, so this is where they have reversed but not negated. And what they've done is they've taken a necessary condition or sufficient. They've treated a necessary condition as if it is sufficient, right? So improving on this type of question, I think, is less about question type and more about the flaw type here, right? So it's more about understanding conditional language and the flawed conclusions that you can come to from a conditional statement, right? So the only logical inference that can be made from a conditional statement is the contrapositive. So the only conclusion I could come to accurately here would be the contrapositive, which I have written out underneath the original. So these two statements cannot be derived from the support that's offered here. So these would be things that we can't know based off of that support. Okay, so that's yeah, and that's basically what we're looking for now in the answer choice, right? The correct answer choice is going to have a mistaken reversal in it. So let's take a look. Since none of the plants in this garden have been pruned before, no plant in this garden needs pruning. This one, I think, has more to do with the timeline issue, right? So the flaw here is just like assuming that since something hasn't happened in the past, it doesn't need to happen. So we actually don't have a conditional relationship that's been flipped here. Since the best mediators have the longest track records, the worst mediators have the shortest track records. So this is assuming a perfect correlation. It's not a mistaken reversal. It also does not really have conditional language. Since only those who desire to become astronauts actually become astronauts, that desire must be the most important factor involved in determining who will become an astronaut. Okay, so yeah, that is saying that since the desire is necessary, the desire must be the most important factor. Again, it's not saying that the desire is sufficient. So just because they're saying it's the most important factor doesn't mean they're saying that it would be enough to get you to become an astronaut, right? So here, they would have had to say that that desire, must be enough to allow you to become an astronaut, or anyone who has that desire will become an astronaut. So it's not quite the same. Since all city dwellers prefer waterfalls to traffic jams, anyone who prefers waterfalls to traffic jams is a city dweller. So do you see the reversal that's happening there? I'm going to do a little like color coding here to show that reversal. So vehicles that have high resale values, and here we have high resale value, and then well maintained on this side and well maintained here. And we have an indicator of a sufficient condition, indicator of a sufficient condition. Here we have indicator of sufficient condition indicator. We have city dwellers, and we have the preference. Kind of mixed up the colors a little bit, but you get the idea, right? Like it's like all A that, prefer B, therefore anyone who prefers B is A, right? The only A's are those that are B, therefore any B has a high A. So it goes if B then A, and then the mistake is to assume that means if A then B. And I really like this one as well because it's like patently absurd, right? It's like just, reading it and understanding what it's talking about, that's absurd, right? We would assume that everybody prefers waterfalls to traffic jams. And so just because you prefer waterfalls to traffic jams doesn't mean that you're a city dweller. I'm sure that if, those people could live in the country as well, or the suburbs. And so it's really obvious that this argument is flawed, but we can see that the structure is the same as the other argument. So that shows that the other argument must be wrong as well. So the structure itself is flawed, not just for that particular subject matter. Okay. So hopefully that helps. This one here also, it's saying like no need, it's not concluding that a necessary condition is sufficient. So okay. That was a longer explanation than I anticipated. So I'm going to actually pause here and come back. All right, so question 7. Rita and Hiro disagree over, right? So they're a point at issue or a point of disagreement. Rita, no matter how you look at them, your survey results are misleading. Since people generally lie on such surveys, the numbers you collected are serious underestimates. Okay, so the results are misleading, and the numbers, like more specifically, they're serious underestimates. So that's the conclusion. And then her support. Let's look at what Hiro has to say. I have no doubt that people lie on surveys of this type. So they don't disagree about that, right? The part that, people lie on surveys. So Hiro concedes that point. The question is whether some people lie more than others. Okay, so there's like nuance to it. while the raw numbers surely underestimate what I'm trying to measure, so they also agree that the numbers collected are underestimates. The relative rates those numbers represent are probably close to being accurate. So that part, the relative rates those numbers represent, that would be the results, right? So not just like the data points, but the rates that they calculate based on those data points. So I would say that the point that they actually disagree about is whether the survey results are misleading or not. So A, the survey results are misleading regardless of how they're interpreted. So I would say they disagree about that. We want something where one of the speakers is going to agree with the statement and the other speaker will disagree with the statement. B, people tend to lie on certain kinds of surveys. They both agree with that. A different type of measure than a survey would produce results that are less misleading. We actually don't know if there's some other type of measure. Like neither of the speakers goes into that, so that would be like out of scope. D, the raw numbers collected are serious underestimates. I think both of them would agree with that. The number of people surveyed was adequate for the survey's purpose. Neither of them actually talks about the number of people. Rita talks about numbers being collected, but that doesn't necessarily refer to the number of people that those numbers are collected from. Yeah, Hero doesn't mention number of people. So that would be out of scope as well. So the correct answer must be A. All right. How does Warrington's argument proceed? So for this one, we're looking at the method of reasoning. And so we kind of want to state what Warrington is doing in his or her argument in abstract or generalized terms. So Lopez says, our university is not committed to liberal arts as evidenced by its decision to close the classics department. So this is a little argument here, right? This is the conclusion of the argument. And then the support or the evidence is here. That's a little one-sentence argument. The study of classical antiquity is crucial to the liberal arts and has been so since the Renaissance. So this is also support for Lopez's argument. Warrington's response. Although the study of classical works is essential to the liberal arts, so we have a concession here. So Warrington agrees with that point. So the study of classical works is essential to liberal arts. A classics department isn't. So makes that like distinction, right? Between the study of classical works versus like formally having a department at the university dedicated to the study of classical works. Why isn't that department necessary? Because other departments will engage in the study of classical work. So yeah, I think that is like just taking issue with how the support offered is connected to the conclusion. So it's the connection between the classics department and the study of classics. All right. So Warrington's argument proceeds by doing what? Offering additional reasons in favor of the conclusion of Lopez's argument. No. Claiming that the reasoning in Lopez's argument rests on an illicit appeal to tradition. No, not concerned with the appeal to tradition, which is the part where Lopez says it's been so since the Renaissance. Warrington does not respond to that. mounting a direct challenge to the conclusion of Lopez's argument? No, actually. So the conclusion of Lopez's argument is our university is not committed to liberal arts. But Warrington really goes for like a distinction, like making a distinction within the evidence, and doesn't directly challenge the conclusion. Responding to a possible objection to the reasoning in Lopez's argument. So this would actually be helping Lopez's argument. So Warrington is actually like raising an objection to the reasoning, not responding to an objection to the reasoning. So if you're responding to an objection to someone's reasoning, you're kind of like sticking up for them while someone else is objecting to the reasoning, and that's not what's happening here. Presenting a consideration. Okay, so the consideration being this, that a classics department isn't necessary for the study of classical works or for liberal arts, because you could study classical works in other departments, and presents that consideration in order to undermine the reasoning in Lopez's argument. Yes. So Warrington is definitely suggesting that Lopez's argument isn't solid. So that's the answer. Just moving right along. Which one of the following principles, if valid, would most help to justify Tatiana's decision? So we're adding a principle to try to justify. So it's a strengthen question, certainly in the strengthen family. Very similar, I would think, to a sufficient assumption question, but the correct answer doesn't have to be sufficient to be the right answer. It just has to be the one that's the closest to sufficient, right? It most helps to justify, but it doesn't have to perfectly justify the argument here or the decision. Okay, so Ted, a senior employee, believes he is underpaid and attempts to compensate by routinely keeping short hours, though it is obvious to everyone that he still makes some valuable, unique, and perhaps irreplaceable contributions. Okay, some valuable, unique, and perhaps irreplaceable contributions. Lots of modifying words there. Okay. Tatiana, who is Ted's supervisor, is aware of the deficit in Ted's performance. So the deficit being that he keeps short hours, and realizes other workers work harder than they should to make up for it. Nevertheless, Tatiana decides that she should not request that Ted be replaced. All right, so that's her decision. We're trying to help justify her decision. So despite these issues, he still makes some valuable, unique, and perhaps irreplaceable contributions, and that is obvious to everyone. So maybe even like the fact that the other workers are aware of that is helpful, right? Because they're working harder to make up for him keeping short hours. Okay. So let's see. Supervisors should request that an employee be replaced only if they know that all the work done by that employee can be performed equally well by another employee. So this sets up a necessary condition. Let's write this out. So if a supervisor should request replacement, then all the work can be done by someone else. Or, supervisor knows that all their work can be done by someone else. So we're just going to do a bit of a shorthand, of course, for it. We don't want to write all of that out all the time. But what we would be looking at here with this conditional is a contrapositive where if the supervisor doesn't know that all the work can be done by someone else, so we're negating the necessary condition here, right? So if the supervisor doesn't know, yada, 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 then the supervisor should not request replacement, which is the conclusion that Tatiana comes to, right? So can we say, based on the information we've been given, that Tatiana doesn't know that all the work done by this employee can be performed equally well by another employee? That, yeah. So he still makes some perhaps irreplaceable contributions. So even though they're only perhaps irreplaceable, we don't know for sure that they're irreplaceable. We certainly don't know for sure that they are replaceable, right? So Tatiana doesn't know that someone else can do everything that Ted does, because some of the things that he does are perhaps irreplaceable. So A should be the correct answer, because A would actually be a sufficient assumption that we could add. So if we added this principle, it would be sufficient to make the argument work. So there really isn't going to be anything else that's going to better help justify Tatiana's decision. So I would just go ahead and pick this one and move on. Okay. Looking at the other answer choices, though, let's see. Employers should compensate all their employees in a way that is adequate in relation to the value of the contributions they make. So this isn't really going to help justify the decision. It's just talking about compensation, and we're not really dealing with that. Tatiana, it's whether she is going to request that he be replaced. So that's not going to be relevant. C, only someone with greater authority than a particular employee supervisor is entitled to decide whether that employee should be replaced. Yeah, this isn't going to really help us one way or another. This might explain why Tatiana's decision is about a request rather than about whether or not she is going to replace Ted, but it doesn't help us take the information we know about Ted and lead us to Tatiana's decision from that, which is really what we're looking for. We want something that's going to connect the support that we have for the decision to the decision, rather than like explaining why that's within her decision-making capacity, if that makes sense, like within her ambit of decision-making. All right, D, workers in a work setting should regard themselves as jointly responsible for the work to be performed. Again, yeah, not relevant to Tatiana's decision here. E, an employee's contributions to the workplace are not always a function of the amount of time spent on the job. So this one would maybe help, right? So the amount of time spent, that's Ted's main issue, is that he's keeping short hours, but he's still able to contribute. The issue with E is that it's kind of redundant at this point, because they're already telling us that even though he keeps short hours, he still makes some valuable, unique, and perhaps irreplaceable contributions. So we know that like time spent on the job isn't the be all and end all of someone's contributions in the workplace. Okay, moving on. Which one of the following, if true, most contributes to a resolution of the apparent discrepancy mentioned above? So let's figure out what that discrepancy is. One adaptation that enables an animal species to survive despite predation by other species is effective camouflage. Yet, some prey species with few or no adaptations to counteract predation have endured for a long time with black and white coloration that seems unlikely to provide effective camouflage. So that's the discrepancy, like that seems unlikely to provide effective camouflage. So let's figure out maybe why black and white coloration would still provide effective camouflage. Maybe, or yeah, let's take a look at that. So most species with black and white coloration are more populous than the species that prey upon them. That's kind of the end result. It doesn't like explain how we're able to get there. So how is it that those species are able to be more populous than the ones that prey upon them, right? If the ones that prey on them are able to pick them out really easily, then eventually we would expect that they might even go extinct, right? I mean, so the fact that they're more populous doesn't resolve the discrepancy. It actually just contributes to the discrepancy. B, no form of camouflage is completely effective against all kinds of predators. Okay. But why is it that this unlikely kind of camouflage isn't totally ineffective against predators, right? So just because no form of camouflage is like 100% effective doesn't help explain why this weird coloration is working effectively for this group. C, animals of many predatory species do not perceive color or pattern in the same manner as humans do. Okay, so that's interesting, right? So the issue that we have with the coloration of this species is that it's black and white. But if the predators don't perceive color or pattern the way that we do, then maybe the fact that the black and white coloration isn't really relevant, right? So maybe the predators for these prey species that have a black and white coloration, maybe those predators don't have color vision, right? They only see in black and white anyways. So it's not like the black and white stripes of a zebra, let's say, that they stand out against the yellows and browns of like a field or the plains, right? So yeah, if everything's black and white, then that might be good camouflage. So I like C. D, conspicuous black and white areas help animals of the same species avoid encounters with one another. Okay. But we're not really worried about animals avoiding encounters with one another, right? Like these are prey species. So yeah, them staying apart from each other isn't really relevant to them as prey, being camouflaged to protect them from predators. E, black and white coloration is not as great a liability against predators at night as it is during the day. I mean, it's not as great a liability. I mean, that's relative. So even if it's like not as bad at night as it is during the day, we still have to worry about daytime, and we might still have to worry about nighttime, right? Like it's comparative. So it might still be a significant liability at night. It's just not as bad as it is during the day. So that doesn't tell me how much of a liability it is, period. Whereas C does give me a potential explanation for how black and white could be effective camouflage against certain kinds of predatory species. All right. Let's keep moving. Question 13. We've got a must be true question. Songwriters get much of the money they earn from their songs from radio airplay. Okay, much of the money. That's I mean, a significant amount, but it doesn't necessarily mean more than 50%. So it's still in the category of some rather than most. A hit song is played thousands of times, and the songwriter is paid for each play. Only a fraction of songwriters actually achieve a hit. So they're like defining a hit song here, right? Let's keep that in mind. And only a fraction of songwriters actually achieve a hit, however, and even fewer manage to write several. Writers of hit songs are often asked to write songs for movie soundtracks, but they sometimes decline because although such songs frequently become hits, their writers receive single upfront payments rather than continued revenues from radio airplay. Okay, interesting. Any songwriter who receives revenue from radio airplay has written a hit song. No, that's not necessarily true, right? You could receive revenue from radio airplay for a song that isn't played thousands of times. It's, played a few times, but you're going to get revenue from those few times. All songwriters who write songs for movie soundtracks have had their songs played on the radio thousands of times. No, so we do know that writers of hit songs are often asked to write songs for movie soundtracks, but we don't know that they're the only songwriters that are asked to write songs for movie soundtracks. That would be it. It would be that they would have like a monopoly, right? All the ones who write movie soundtracks have had that. Yeah. Okay, C, some songs written for movie soundtracks are played on the radio thousands of times. So let's see. Yeah, so movie soundtrack songs frequently become hits. And a hit song is played thousands of times. So yeah, that looks fully supported to me. That's got to be true if all of the statements are true. D, most songwriters prefer the possibility of continued income from single upfront payments. Their writers receive, they sometimes decline. Doesn't give me majority. Some songwriters earn money solely from radio airplay. I can't say that, right? Songwriters get much of the money they earn from radio airplay. I can't say that based on the information that I've been given, right? So even though that seems like, okay, yeah, maybe that's possible. I'm sure there could be a songwriter who's got that kind of relationship, like financial or contractual relationship to their songs, but I don't know it based on the information that I've been given. Whereas this one here, I can follow that line. So some songs written for movie soundtracks. So this is the songs that frequently become hits, right? Songs for movie soundtracks. And then if we go back here, we know that a hit song is played thousands of times. So if it becomes a hit, it's going to be played thousands of times. All right, and the last three questions. So what question type do we have? Which one of the following, if true, adds the most support for the challenge from the modern historians? We're trying to strengthen the modern historians' position here. Stimulus. The traditional view of the Roman Emperor Caligula as a cruel and insane tyrant has been challenged by some modern historians. So we have challenge from modern historians. So the view of Caligula as cruel and insane tyrant. They point out that little documentation of Caligula's alleged cruelty or outrageous behavior survives from the time of his reign, and that the histories that have come down to us were written by his enemies. So it seems like what they're saying is that it could have been made up, right? Were written by his enemies. So we can try to support that. Maybe also, they're pointing out that little documentation survives from the time of his reign. So why would this be a challenge to that view of him? Maybe it would be a challenge because when we have a cruel and insane tyrant, we would expect that there would be a lot of documentation from that tyrant's reign that talks about that. And so the fact that we don't have very much documentation kind of goes against that expectation. So yeah, we can try to support the challenge in those ways, or maybe find another related way to support. So let's see. There's less documentation of any sort from Caligula's reign than from the reigns of most other Roman emperors of Caligula's era. Yeah, so this just there's the documentation overall of all different types didn't survive from that time. That really doesn't show that the fact that there's little documentation about his cruelty means that he actually wasn't cruel, right? So this kind of waters down that evidence. It actually makes it less helpful. B, people who have lived under someone regarded as a cruel tyrant are more likely to view that person unfavorably than favorably. So this one, again, wouldn't support the challenge. It would essentially say, well, I mean, the histories were written by his enemies, but he had a lot of enemies because he was a cruel tyrant, right? And that would again kind of water down that support. C, the specific outrageous acts attributed to Caligula in Roman documentation are very similar to acts attributed in earlier writings to other rulers alleged to be cruel tyrants. So that's interesting. The histories were written by his enemies. The sort of implied claim there is that they made it up, that they said things that weren't true. If they were very similar to things that happened earlier, like in other writings, they could just be kind of copied. Yeah, so C is definitely interesting. I would keep it. It's the best one so far. D, the little documentation that survives from Caligula's reign indicates that the Roman people believed Caligula to be crueler than other emperors who were widely thought to be tyrants. I mean, yeah, that doesn't help us. It doesn't help us challenge the perception. E, there is ample documentation of modern tyrants being responsible for outrageous acts worse than those attributed to Caligula. So I don't really care about that they're worse. It's the documentation part that's more interesting. The problem, of course, is modern tyrants, right? We're talking about documentation surviving from the time of Roman emperors, right? So to compare how much documentation we have from modern tyrants versus from the time of the Roman Empire, that's not going to be very helpful. So I think C is the best one. Definitely a tough question. C, it feels it doesn't feel like the closest, most obvious connection, I would say. But it is there, and most of the other answers actually don't support the challenge, right? So yeah, C is the correct answer. Okay, next one. We're looking for something to logically complete the argument, and this blank here begins with the word because, so looks like we're trying to add support and support the conclusion that the critics are mistaken. At this point, we don't know what the critics are talking about, but just from structure, we can kind of get an idea of like what our task is, and we're trying to add something that's going to complete the argument. So we're really looking for a sufficient assumption here. All right, so critics of a plan to create new building sites from land that currently lies under only 5 meters of water claim that it will reduce the habitat area available to a local subpopulation of dolphins. Okay, so they claim this, right? That's what the critics claim. And the conclusion is that they are mistaken. So, and we have to say why. It's true that the dolphins never enter water more than 30 meters deep, right? And this land is 5 meters. So if I were to make a little doodle, we've got water, and then we have a land. So there's the land. Okay, and the land that they're talking about here is to get this land. Let's say this is where we have, it's just 5 meters. And then they say dolphins never enter water that's more than 30 meters deep. So like way out here, I mean, this is not to scale, but way out here, like dolphins aren't going to go beyond that point. And the current area of habitation is bounded on one side by land and everywhere else by water that's considerably deeper than that. Okay. So their current area of habitation would be between where it's much deeper and the land. So the real question is like, is this part here habitat that the dolphins are using? Or are they really just using all of this space here, and taking away this isn't really going to reduce their habitat? Okay, so A, the dolphin's current habitat area is large enough to support a dolphin population several times the size of the current one. So, I mean, this one is kind of suggesting that like it's not going to make that much of a difference to the dolphins if we reduce their habitat by this little amount, because they've got so much habitat. The issue is that we're not really talking about whether or not it's going to like impact their population to the point that it can't support their population anymore. It's just whether or not it would reduce the habitat area available to them. So that's the question. So this isn't going to help. B, the dolphins do not inhabit water that is less than 10 meters deep. All right, so that is perfect, right? It tells me that dolphins happy here, happy here, happy here. And then when we get to about, the 10 meter mark, then the dolphins aren't going to be here anyways. So really, taking away this chunk here isn't going to make a difference because the dolphins weren't there anyways. This is their habitat, not all of this area. So B is perfect. Threat to the population, we're not talking again about the threat to the population, we're talking about specifically reduction of habitat. Average depth of water, average is really not very helpful, right? Because the calculation of the average could include just 5 meters deep. A short distance from the dolphin's habitat area, the ocean floor drops to a depth of 100 meters. Yeah, again, I don't really care about that. Yeah, and we've found our answer already, but this is going to be one of the boundaries, and it is sort of suggesting that the habitat area is small, but we're talking about whether or not taking away this specific part of land will reduce the habitat area. So whether that area is large or small to begin with, it could still be reduced if it included the part that's under only 5 meters of water. And last question. Okay. So we have a pattern of reasoning argument, but it doesn't say it's flawed or questionable. So it looks like we're just figuring out structure here. We're not worried about a flaw. Okay. Any popular television series that is groundbreaking is critically acclaimed, but not all popular television series are critically acclaimed. Thus, not all popular television series are groundbreaking. Okay, so we've got a combination of conditional reasoning and quantitative qualifiers. Okay, so quantity words, amount. So any, right, that's like 100%, that's going to give us a conditional statement, right? So if it's groundbreaking, then it will be critically acclaimed, right? If a popular television series is groundbreaking, it will also be critically acclaimed. If it's not critically acclaimed, then not groundbreaking. Our next statement, but not all popular television series are critically acclaimed. So this, not all, and we have it again here, that means the same thing as some are not. Okay, so if not all popular television series are critically acclaimed, that means some popular television series are not critically acclaimed. We could also say that some TV series that are not critically acclaimed are popular. Right? So that is not the contrapositive, because a statement that starts with some is not a conditional statement, right? Notice I don't have an arrow here. I'm not using the word if. This is not conditional. This is about quantity. So if we look at all of the popular TV series, we will find at least a few, right? At least, more than one that's not critically acclaimed. Okay. And then the conclusion is some popular TV series are not groundbreaking, right? So not all, some, so not all A's are, some A's are not B. That's the format. So that's how we take not all and we turn it into some are not. And I've got that little slash there to represent not. We can also say that some TV series that are, oh, I almost put an arrow there. Some TV series that are not groundbreaking are popular. So there's an overlap between those two criteria. All right, so we want a conditional statement and a quantitative statement in our premises, and then we want our conclusion to be quantitative, and we want it to work, right? So if it's true that some of these are popular TV series, well, those ones that are not critically acclaimed are also not groundbreaking, and so we can say that that same group is not going to be groundbreaking. And if it's not critically acclaimed, it's not groundbreaking. So we're using the contrapositive of the conditional statement. Okay, so first thing I would just look for conclusions that are quantitative. Okay. And so if they're conditional, I would eliminate. So here we have so, since, blah, blah, blah. Articles are not widely read if they are academic works. I would eliminate this one. It's got the word if, it's conditional. That's not equivalent to the phrase not all, which is quantitative. So she thinks those students' work is greatly improved. We don't have anything equivalent to not all, right? So I would eliminate that one. So not all biographies are unbiased. That follows the pattern. So it must be that he is polite to all of his colleagues. No, that's not the right quantity, right? It's 100% rather than some. And so not all books are worth buying. So just based off of looking at the conclusion, we can eliminate all of the answer choices except for 2. So now it's between C and E. And now we want, yeah, we just want that pattern. So one way to look at it would be not groundbreaking. So we're going to do the negation of the sufficient condition. So here we have if a biography is unbiased, and so not all biographies are unbiased, right? Some are not biased. If or any popular TV series is groundbreaking, not all are groundbreaking. So that looks good. If a book is worth reading, and then it goes to not all books are worth buying. So it should end with not all books are worth reading if we want to follow that same pattern. So C has got to be the correct answer. So for these ones where we're not looking for a flaw, it really is about that skeleton of the argument and pattern recognition. So it's actually quite a different task, even though we have flawed pattern of reasoning and pattern of reasoning, and they seem like very similar question types. Because in one we've got flawed arguments and the other we don't, the way that we go about assessing them is a bit different. We still have the structural component for sure, but finding the flaw is a huge part of the other question type, right? Okay, that'll be it. I've gone on long enough with these guys, but if you have follow-up questions, please let me know.